Right, let's take a closer look at this macro. The actual macro that outputs the tiles is just from this section here all the way down to this section here. I do have another macro called letter tiles, which basically does the same thing, but it is for letter size pages. We're not going to talk about that. You can play with that later if you wish, I just want to talk you through how this works. So the first line here is macro 8-inch tiles. That signifies to Campaign Cartographer that we have a new macro called 8-inch tiles. So when you type in 8-inch tiles after this has been loaded into memory, this script between this title and the end macro down here, end M, will run. Now let's look at the procedure that it runs through. First of all, it runs the command gn n column scale 40. Now that's basically what that's doing is it's setting a number variable. It gets a number, it creates the variable n column scale 40, and then we get the row scale minus 40. Now these numbers here will be the increment in map units, in this case 40 feet, between each of the tiles. And the reason I've created them as variables is if you did create a map that you wanted to use a metric tile system for, 1.5 meters, then you could change that to 12 because each tile would be 12 meters as opposed to 40 feet. So these are setting the variables for our scale that iterates through the map. Now we get a variable, which is a piece of text, and it is S name, and we're setting it to tile. In other words, we take a variable, we call it tile. So S being a string sets to tile, the text tile. And then I reiterate through that to ask people to get the tile name. And that's what will pop up a little message on the screen asking people to type in the tile name, and the default will be the word tile. The next get is to get a point, GP, get point. And that point is a point on your map, and it is P start. By the way, this little caret symbol D means ask the user. Basically, that's the quick way of thinking about that. So this will say to the user, start at, they will click on a point on their map, and that will set it to that variable, that point variable there. Next, we ask the user to set G columns. How many columns are we going to iterate through to generate our tiles? And again, the little caret D columns will show to the user, and then they can type in however many columns, 10, 12, 5, whatever it is. The next variable we set is another number for the rows, and again, we ask them with the caret D to get the number of rows. So they could type in, again, any number of rows they wished. We then set a variable called row count. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do two iterative loops, one for rows and one for columns. So the first thing that we do is we set a variable, row count, to 0. If there is an error, then we'll go straight to macro done. That's a bit of checking to make sure that we don't keep on looping through error after error after error. It very rarely gets activated. We hide the sheet print grid 8-inch, so you can automatically hide sheets to make sure that they don't get printed. We could change that to the name of the sheet layer, the guide layer in our service, if we so wished. This little colon symbol here, followed by a name, says this is a new part of the script. It's a new, not quite function, but it's a new segment of the script that we can return back to. We now set another variable for the column count to 0, and we create a new part of our loop, a new section of our script called column loop. So all of that is basically just setting up our two looping algorithms that will work through the columns and the rows. Now, we have to create a unique name for every single tile that we output. And this little piece of script does that. First of all, it creates a new variable called sFileName, and it starts it with C:\tiles. Now, it is possible, it would be possible to make this potentially a field that a user could type in, but I just normally just leave it to tiles. So all of our map tiles that we generate from this are going to go to C:\tiles. Feel free to change that if you want to put them elsewhere. To this variable, we append the file name. So we're appending the file name, the S name, and we entered the S name up here. So if we called our map Big Bad Spaceship, it would be C:\tiles /Big Bad Spaceship. Then we append again to the file name, so we're adding to it again, the row count. And then we append to it again a dash, actually an underscore, and then we append to it again the column count. So at the first iteration through this, the row count would be 0 and the column count would be 0. So the very first tile that comes off would be, you guessed it, C:\tiles Big Bad Spaceship 0 dash underscore 0. And finally, we end it with PNG. So that's what creates the name. Next, we'll just scroll down a little bit there. We are going to create the point at where we start our tile. Now remember, we already know where we're going to start the entire iteration through the maps, but we need to have a point to tell Campaign Cartographer where the start and the end of the tile that it's outputting at this iteration is. So I call this get a point top left, TL for top left. And the reference is the start position, the column scale times by the column count. In other words, that would be 0 times 0, P start. So it's offsets, because it's a reference there, we're using reference. It offsets from P start, which we selected, or the user selected earlier up in this point here. And basically it offsets that by that many points. And likewise for the row count. Make sense? I certainly hope so. Then we set the bottom right corner of the tile we're outputting, and basically it is a reference of the column versus the previous point that we've just created, this one here, offsetting it with the column scale and the row scale. So if this was, say, point 4040, then we would go, the next lower point would be point 80, 0. Got it? Hope so. This command here basically outputs it. So that's like when we would manually type save as. And because we have the file name, it knows what to do. And because we've already preset all of our export details in the options, it will output it to that point. We're also on a new line telling it to start at the very first point we've calculated here. The second point is the end point. Now, if you think of it, this is literally as if we had typed in save as and then our file name, then we click this point, and we click that point, but we've automated all of that. What we then do is we increase the column count by 1, and if that column count greater than the column loop, we continue. And we would do another increment, this time of the row count, and again, we check it to see if we need to go up. So basically, that's basically saying, have we reached our maximum column count for this iteration? If so, go all the way back up to the column loop and start all of this again. If not, continue. And likewise, have we finished this row entirely? Well, if we finished the row entirely, go back up. And once we've finished all of that, basically we've looped through all of the tiles that we needed to output. So it quickly iterates through that. It then goes and turns the grid back on, the sheet back on if that's what we wished, and then ends the macro. So there you go. It's basically just a nested loop. Now, if that looks rather complicated for you, I apologize. The Campaign Cartographer's scripting language is quite sophisticated. If you want to find out more about it, please go and buy the Tome of Ultimate Mapping. It's pretty much the only source I know that has a really good, complete list of all of the commands.